Hello, I'm Dr Hannah Yelin, Senior Lecturer in Media and Culture and Network Lead for the Creative Industries Network. Welcome and thank you for coming to the inaugural Creative Industries Festival. It's been a fantastically successful week so far. I should just say that we are filming, so if you don't want your little icon to be visible of you, please turn off your camera. We'll be keeping the audience muted throughout, but welcome all comments and questions in the chat box. Our first week has been themed on the future of the creative industries. And it really is the hugest honour and privilege to close the discussions of this week with Labour Shadow Chancellor, the first ever female Shadow Chancellor, Anneliese Dodds, who is our local MP for Oxford East, where our main Headington campus is located. Hi, Anneliese, thank you so much for joining us. Over the last year, Anneliese has held the government to account, managing that balance of both opposition and collaboration with the Chancellor, which makes the role of Shadow Chancellor such a famously challenging one. But more specifically, with regard to the creative industries, she has challenged the government on the gaps in the furlough scheme that need to be closed for freelance and self-employed creatives. And she has been warning them about the risk of a skills exodus in this sector in particular. Anneliese, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like you might, in regular times, be the busiest woman in the UK. And I don't think we realised when we planned this quite what a significant day it was going to be, being the day of the by-election results, all the various elections across the country. So thank you especially for joining us in what must be an incredibly busy day for Labour. How are you feeling after the mixed results of the day? What do you think this means, for Labour in the immediate term?
Yeah, good morning. And it's really, really good to be with you. I would say the first thing that I'm feeling is rather sore in the legs, actually, having spent all of yesterday knocking on people's doors, encouraging them to go and vote. So that's the overwhelming feeling, and a little bit of tiredness, I suppose, but just such a strange election. And I think perhaps for me, the fact that it has been such a peculiar campaign compared to usual hasn't necessarily fed through to a lot of the coverage. Normally there would be months and months of knocking on doors, talking to people. That hasn't happened this time. So, to me, the results are not that surprising given that context and the fact that Labour tends to rely on that kind of ground campaign, to put it in a more military way, compared to certainly the Conservative Party. But anyway, we are where we are. And obviously, my party does need to learn from where we've sustained losses. I think we may see some gains coming through over the weekend, but certainly from those losses, we've got to learn from them, obviously, and change into the future. But yeah, it's just so good to be with you, and I'm really delighted to hear about how successful the festival's been. I think it's really important. I hope it may become an annual event. No pressure, Dr. Yelin there and the rest of the team, but really important that you're doing this, and so delighted that it's been happening in Oxford, of course.
Thank you. Us too. I mean, and I think we just can't help. We just keep wanting to do more and more and more events, and more people get in touch with us. So there will probably be lots more things coming sooner than we have energy for ourselves. But anyway, so let's talk about the creative industries and just historically, what do you think the role has been? How important do you think the creative industries have been economically for the UK?
Yeah, I mean, they've obviously been incredibly important, particularly in terms of exports, where they've been really an area of our export strength that's been growing in a way that we haven't seen from many other sectors. I mean, clearly the pandemic has had a very negative impact there, but I'm absolutely determined that into the future we will see that strength growing again. I mean, just some of the stats that we've pulled together in 2019, arts and culture contributed 10.47 billion to the UK economy. That was in gross value added, obviously very substantial. 0.5% of UK economic output, but as I say, punching above its weight when it comes to exports in particular, and huge numbers of jobs as well. I mean, 226,000 jobs directly in arts and culture, but I would imagine there would be many, many more which are then dependent on that direct employment in arts and culture, different parts of organisations and support for them related to those activities. Those direct jobs are split between arts and entertainment, jobs in museums, libraries, and other cultural attractions as well. So a really important part of our economy, and one which we must preserve, I think, and build on for the future.
And so what do you think, in terms of building on it for the future, what do you think needs to happen now, and can the creative industries play an active positive role as we rebuild now from this awful pandemic?
Yeah, definitely. I think they really need to. I know that we're going to go on and talk about the social impact. Of course, that's incredibly important, but just looking at the economic impact, actually over the 10 years after the last recession, the global financial crisis, of course, in 2008 to 9, we saw that the growth rate in creative industries actually was 3 times as high as that in UK industry on average. So this is a really quickly growing sector. If we look, for example, just at what's classified as motion picture, video and TV program production, probably not the way that necessarily many people working in that area of broadcast and creativity would describe themselves. But anyway, looking just at that area, it grew by 6 times the UK industry average. So we really have seen over those 10 years until the pandemic, really strongly growing impact of arts and entertainment, creative industries broadly. And I think it's really important that we make sure we've got the foundation still as we come out of this crisis to see that kind of growth again. And obviously that relates to the workforce, it relates to investment opportunities, relates to the overall context for creative industries. I'm sure we'll go on to talk about some of that in a moment.
Well, given the extreme value, even if we were just talking economically rather than everything else that the arts and creative and cultural sector gives us, what do you make of Gavin Williamsons' proposal? It wasn't proposed this week, but it's had a lot of coverage this week, of a 50% cut to art subjects in higher education. It's being hailed as catastrophic in the press yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. That consultation closed last night, and I am extremely concerned about it. I mean, even just looking at the language, the way that this has been described, the Office for Students states in that consultation, the government does not consider art subjects to be as strategically important as other high cost, in their words, disciplines. Well, actually, we've just been talking about how much the creative industries have been growing previously. It's a very peculiar set of priorities, I think, to be adopting that approach right now. And I'm concerned about the impact that will have on our universities, many of them struggling already, and the impact, of course, that it could have on students who would then be denied those opportunities when I think they should be part of the UK's economic future as well as cultural future.
And just widening inequalities of who gets to access what kinds of opportunities. Okay, so you've alluded already to the fact that the creative sector does so much more for us than just the economic, which is obviously very important and important right now. But what about our social recovery and our collective healing after the trauma of the last year? What role do you see arts and culture and creativity playing there?
And I think they'll be absolutely fundamental. I think they've played a very important role during the pandemic, actually. I think they've been incredibly important. But moving out of it, we know that the creative industries have a huge impact on people's well-being, really enormous impact. I mean, we can see that, for example, in our hospitals, the amount of creative work that goes on within them really, I think, does underline, that doesn't happen just for the sake of it. It happens because there is that clear link actually between people's well-being and creativity, and being able to experience the arts in a really positive way when they need that kind of connection. So I think it is going to be very important. I would just say also, of course, our creative industry is so important for so much of the rest of our lives, really important when it comes to tourism, for example, developing jobs. Obviously, we've been talking about that, developing skills that would be transferable, not just in kind of creative industries, more narrowly drawn, but across lots of other areas as well. Economic regeneration as well. You look at what's happened up and down the country when there has been that economic regeneration. So often it's been driven actually by the creative industries and by people coming to places because they know they will have that experience of our arts and entertainment and our creative industries more generally. So I think it really will be very, very important. And as I say, I think we've learned really through this pandemic about the power of the creative industries and how they can support particularly our mental health and well-being.
Yeah. So as we rebuild, how do we make sure that all of those good things are accessible to all? I mean, is there a way that the creative industries can help us towards building a more fair, less unequal society?
I really think that there are ways that we need to ensure everyone is able to access the creative industries in a whole variety of ways. So whether that's people able to visit different venues, different places, to access different types of culture and art, or whether we're talking about those who are directly employed within those industries, there's obviously a huge amount to be done. And I think we can particularly see that actually in a city like our own one, where we've got incredible cultural resources, of course, scientific ones as well. And there's really exciting work, I think, in Oxford about the interaction between the two. But where far too often we see that, often not through direct exclusion at all, but through kind of structural factors, we don't see everyone in our city able to benefit. And I think there's a huge amount that can be done there. I think there's a lot of very exciting work actually, again, taking place in places like Oxford, where you've got different outreach programs run by the museums. You've got a lot of engagement actually often from different local artists and creative entrepreneurs and creative individuals getting their work out there, bringing others in a whole variety of contexts. But I think we really need to build on that. I think it's incredibly important.
And what would you say to any who perceive the creative industries as a topic that is just a preserve of the metropolitan elite, to use a kind of word that's used in a phrase that's used in the media? I mean, what about things like grassroots creativity and its role around the whole country?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, it might sound like a bit of a slogan, but I think there's creativity everywhere, there's talent everywhere, but there's not opportunity everywhere. I mean, it's pretty obvious that, wherever you go in the UK, actually, you'll see people who are creative, you'll see how people, take over different community spaces, for example, how they often produce their own culture. I mean, that's something that's been happening throughout the UK's history. It's one of the things that makes us such an exciting country to live in. And we see how that's then been enriched by people coming from all across the world, of course, to cities like Oxford and, building an even richer culture there. But the opportunity really, really isn't there. And, again, some of the statistics are really quite concerning here. There's interesting work that's been done by Beck2 and others. If we look, for example, last year, just 16% of those in creative occupations are from working class backgrounds. That's compared to 21% of people in other professional occupations who are from working class backgrounds. And people from a privileged background are more than twice as likely to end up working in creative occupations than people who would describe themselves as working class. So there's a really, really big gap there. And as I say, that doesn't reflect actually people's talent at all. It really does reflect whether the opportunities are there. And, it does, I have to say, it does concern me. I think about my own childhood, the opportunities that were there around, for example, learning a musical instrument, taking part in collective activities, where there has been a lot of change over recent years. And we've got really dedicated people who are working to try and make the situation the best it can be. But where I think to an extent, some of those ladders have been pulled up, unfortunately, that were there previously. We need to put them back in place.
Yeah, so I was reading things like schemes that were in place specifically to widen participation. Those have been the first to go, like internships and paid internships and things. That's really hard to provide now for organisations that have been forced to close for a year. So do you have any thoughts on how we support the creative industries, how we rebuild the creative industries now, with a view to making sure that we build them back to be more inclusive than they were before?
I think that's a really important point. And actually, as you say, when you look at the methods for recruitment into many of those creative industries, quite often they rely on people being willing or able to do quite a lot of work for free. I find this, I have a number of friends involved in photography, for example, where very often the assumption will be that there can be a lot of work that's done for free or just to cover the cost of materials, just to get work out there. And now that's fine if you have an independent income, but the vast majority of people don't. And therefore there's an immediate barrier there. That's obviously intensified further if internships are not paid. If we have those other kinds of barriers to access. And I think there's a lot that can be done. There are some organisations that are doing really good work here to support people, to make sure that they do actually have that backing, not just so that they can come in, for example, as an intern, a paid intern, but then so that they can have career progression as well. Because quite often people will get to that stage of having got some experience, but then they'll just be recycled into, another internship or another placement, not actually getting that permanent job that's necessary. I think some of the kind of career models as well really need to be looked at very, very carefully. And I'd say, interestingly, there's a lot of parallels here, and we see this in Oxford with the structure for scientists and those involved in academia as well. Very often many extremely lean years for a long time that can't really be coped with if you have, caring responsibilities, for example. And again, if you don't have access to any means to support yourself economically. So I do think that needs to be looked at much more carefully for the future.
So my own research is on the topic of girls and their future aspirations. And what we found is that when they see how women and queer people and people of colour are treated in the public eye, it can not be a kind of a role model, but an active discouragement from aspiring to those kinds of roles, because they see the risk and how difficult it can be. So what responsibility do you think that cultural producers and creative industries gatekeepers have to ensure that young, diverse talent aren't being put off?
I think that's really important research that you're undertaking, and it is a very difficult issue. And I mean, interestingly, when you were talking, I was thinking about the situation for people becoming involved in politics, actually, where it's often very similar, that, clearly you're having to, I suppose, put yourself out there, to coin a phrase, you're having to have a kind of public persona. Particularly, I mean, it's kind of a trite thing to say, but I think it is true, having kind of lived through this over the last 20 years of political engagement with the growth of social media. We are in a different context to where we were before. It's very, very easy to disseminate information and disseminate work, but it's also very easy to get negative comment back on it. And often, that will be, unfortunately, sexist comment or racist, or have other aspects related to people's personal characteristics that are, denigrating and discriminatory. I think there is a lot that can be done to support individuals at that stage, to make sure that they feel part of a network, both through peer support, mentoring as well. Also being clear about what the boundaries are, when it's not acceptable comments, if it's threatening and that kind of thing, or persistent undermining, those kinds of things. But I would say, I think this goes beyond the arts themselves. I think there is a responsibility for those who, for example, actually host those platforms, where we haven't often seen strong enough, fast enough action against content that's inappropriate. We really do need to see responsibility being taken and being shouldered, much more than it has been until now.
On social platforms, but also in mainstream media as well, of course. There's plenty of inappropriate things get said on the news, for example.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting whether that's changing or otherwise. I mean, obviously there have been really strong movements, for example, the Me Too movement, many others as well, Black Lives Matter, really clearly trying to shine a spotlight on where there has been, those inappropriate representations and discriminatory representations previously. And I'm just thinking about an interview that I heard with Tracey Emin recently. I don't know if anybody else heard it. It was on, I think it was on Women's Hour, where she was saying that actually, for a very long time, I mean, I think she's been active for, at least 25, 30 years in the arts, maybe longer, where obviously her art is very kind of self-declamatory, it's very, very personal. And for quite a long time, she was heavily criticized for that. Actually, she's kind of lived through that experience, seen how things have changed. And she seemed to give the impression that she felt there was more space for that kind of discussion in the public realm now. I think there may be some more space for that, but I think also the kind of character of some of the criticism has changed as well. And as I say, particularly through social media, there is more scope for some to engage in discriminatory behaviour than there would have been perhaps previously.
You're right. It's good though to have Tracey Emin back in public discourse. I enjoyed that too. So back to this state of our creative industries. It has been a really difficult year, hasn't it? I mean, we're talking about what creative organisations need to do now, but for many of them, all our theatres, all our cinemas, all our museums, all of the kind of music venues and clubs, all forced to close. And of course, we've seen lots of fantastic innovation and using more digital, but for some, those obstacles just can't be worked around. So how do you see the current health of our creative industries right now?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's been, I think you said it was a torrid year. I mean, it really has been. It's been an incredibly difficult year. And I think you're right. And sometimes I've felt there's been some slightly kind of lazy representations of quite how easy it is to move work online, for example, how difficult it is to then ensure that washes its face financially, just in terms of supporting the costs of those involved. It's not as easy as just, I don't know, having a camera in front of a play and then assuming that people will necessarily pay the same amount to see that, and that would even work in the first place. So it really has been difficult. There's been incredible innovation, but that innovation itself has, required a huge amount of effort. And, a lot of the time people not really being reimbursed for that actually in the way that they would have been normally. And I think we've seen that really feeding through into the employment figures. So again, Bect's done really interesting work here. They surveyed 4,000 workers in the creative industries and found that just over a third weren't actually working anymore, either in the creative industries or in another industry. Now, obviously, a lot of those people will be hoping to continue to work into the creative industries in the future once things start to reopen. But one of my major concerns is that unless we have a clearer future for those industries, we could see a lot of people moving out of them, and that being a kind of structural shift out of the creative industries when we'll need them to be, building up into the future. What needs to happen? Well, I would say, I mean, first of all, we need to have a clearer acknowledgement about the future of creative industries for our economy. I mean, we talked about this before, but so often they're missed out. And I think all that, pretty frustrating argument around viability reflected that, a view that somehow these were quite ephemeral parts of the UK economy. They're not. They need to be supported. That should have, in my view, fed into then an approach to support packages which acknowledge the kind of mechanisms of employment in the creative industries, the use of freelancers, of people who'd have a mix of different types of contract, for example, that just was not acknowledged. So huge numbers of people who've been missed out of the self-employed payment, for example. This is something that I've talked with Tracy Brabin, who's actually Labour's probably still candidate now. We don't know if she will have been elected, but anyway, I hope she has been, for West Yorkshire Mayor, who worked in the arts herself for a very, very long time. She's an actress, and she's pointed out to me that it just doesn't seem to have been that understanding of how people actually work in the sector, and it's led to obviously a lot of hardship, but potentially a lot of reduction in capacity for the future as well. And then I think we need to be looking at, this might sound like a slightly peculiar way of putting it, given the cultural impact of these industries, but we do need to be looking at the arts as an element of industrial strategy for the future. That means having a proper, what's called sector deal, where we get the different actors together, the different organisations with government, work out what needs to be there to really build them up into the future, whether that's through different forms of investment, again, a better acknowledgement of the patterns of employment, how they can be supported, other regulatory issues as well. Clearly, that's going to be important around testing, and I think we might maybe talk about that later, but really getting those issues dealt with so that we can have that brighter future for our creative industries, I think is going to be very important.
You've preempted what was going to be my next question there brilliantly. I was going to ask whether the government's actions, whether their financial support and so forth suggests, do they recognise the importance of the sector? But actually what you're saying is perhaps they don't even really understand how it works. So how can they value the sector if they even actually on a fundamental level don't recognise its mechanisms?
Yeah, I think that's right, unfortunately. And, I have tried to raise this a number of times. Oh, sorry, about to sneeze. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you. My first Zoom sneeze, I think, live. But anyway, there you go. So I have kind of raised this a number of times with the Chancellor. Actually, I've written to him 6 times around the issues here, the different gaps in the support schemes. We really do need to learn from that for the future. I mean, I think actually it's important as well so that we can have more security in the sector where that's what people want. Often people do want flexibility, but very often they'll want security as well. And clearly, for people who have had a kind of mixture of self-employment plus PAYE contracts on a short-term basis, they've really suffered when it comes to issues around, if they're off work sick, for example, the fact there isn't a proper sick pay regime covering people in those circumstances, as well as the lack of support too. So I think we really do need to be developing that better understanding in government of how the sector works. I mean, I would say that, within DCMS, I think so that the relevant department for culture, media and sport, I think there is perhaps a better understanding of how the sector works, but it seems to me that's not really fed through then, unfortunately, into the Treasury.
Thank you for that. It's a great flag for next Tuesday. We have Ruth Y from DCMS, from the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, talking about the creative industries. So everybody please come to that as well. Okay, so you've raised that there's a number of uncertainties. Of course, one big uncertainty is Brexit. There's questions for artists who travel, music artists, and what their visa status is going to be, and there's so many questions still. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about where we are with that.
Absolutely. Well, we're not where we should be with this situation at all, and I mean it's a problem for those artists who potentially, kind of ridiculous situations that whereas before they would have been able to go and do a European tour and go to, all the major cities that would have been normal, or even, often more out of the way places for, really interesting different acts. Where now we're talking about a situation where they might have to go to, kind of individual countries and then back. I mean, there's no way that this can make sense. And of course, it's not just those individual performers. I've talked to, for example, specialist lighting services, specialist sound services, specialist providers of tour buses as well. I've been on calls with all of them in my role as Shadow Chancellor, and they've been talking about how they've raised at the very beginning of this process the fact that there would need to be appropriate regulations and mechanisms in place so that they could do their job. I mean, the UK is actually, as well as in our creative industries, we've got tremendous strengths and specialisation around those support services for our creative industries as well. Our country's, world renowned actually for that. And yet we've not put the right mechanisms in place so this can work for the future. And people really concerned even about whether they'll be able to retain some of the kit and the different types of machinery that they have currently to support that, as well as that impact on performers. We need to get the situation sorted out. There's obviously been a heated debate around, whose fault it is. Frankly, from Labour's point of view, we don't care about whose fault it is. We need it to get fixed, and we need it to be fixed very urgently. It won't just be a problem for UK-based individuals involved in the creative industries. It will be a big loss for the EU 27 as well, if we can't see that continued collaboration that's been so fundamental to our culture and creativity generally over the last few years.
Okay, so I'm going to come to the end of our questions soon. I've just got one or two more, and then we're going to go to, I can see there's been a huge amount of really great discussion in the chat box, but I wanted us to end optimistically. So I just wondered if you could give us a kind of a summary of what you think the potential is of the creative industries and how great they could be, or could be again, or even greater, and what you would like to see happen, or how you would like to see them supported, or what ultimately is your vision for the creative industries in this country going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that actually our creative industries have shown their potential for the future during this crisis, as well as having all those, awful impacts on them. What I've seen, I mean, just looking at Oxford and what's taken place, I've seen absolutely incredible creativity. I've seen, many organisations that often were working together already, but intensifying that collaboration in incredibly creative ways. And of course, we'd expect it with these industries, but the way in which they've done that has been so impressive. You think about the approach in the Oxford Playhouse, for example, Oxford Fire Station, the way that they've worked with kind of different individuals involved, self-employed individuals involved, different producers, actors, artists, trying to support them. The manner in which they've then worked with other organisations. So quite often they've, for example, been fundamental to helping with the support effort for vulnerable people, because those in the creative industries are used to being flexible. They're used to working with each other, to having a collaborative approach. That's lent itself really well to what we've seen in Oxford, which has been incredibly impressive. So I think there really is that bright future. I think we need to build on that flexibility and creativity and collaboration. I think we've seen the best of the creative industries a lot of the time during this crisis, even with all of those trials and tribulations, and even worse than that, direct closures, obviously, that we've seen through this crisis. I think that we should be really proud of our creative industries in the UK, that they really are, the jewel in the crown a lot of the time of our economy, as well as our society. And I, for one, I just can't wait until we get back to the stage that we were at before and build on it, where in a city like ours, right now we would be coming up to so many different examples of our creative industries in the city working together. I think that this crisis is fully over, when we're able to have, for example, Cowley Road Carnival, which of course has got, Cowley Road Works right at the centre of it, working with artists from right across the city and beyond, artists of a whole variety of natures, I should say, music, art, performance in other ways. That will be, I think, for me, when we're starting to move out of this crisis. And I think there will be an appetite from people to engage even more than they have done before. Once we have the chance to be in those kinds of venues and places together with others, I think we'll all remember what it was like when we couldn't be there, and how joyful and how important it is to all of us to continue with that.
Lovely. Okay, the last thing I want to say is that our audience is made up of creative practitioners, academics who are doing research related to the creative industries, interested members of the public. What would you like to say to our audience in particular? Any kind of call to action or kind of rallying optimist? I don't know. Just, given that that's who's here today, what would you like to say before we take their questions?
I suppose, first of all, I'd like to thank people who are on this call, because, as I say, particularly just in my own city, and I'm sure this has been happening right up and down the country, we've seen how there's been so much support, both across the creative industries for others within those industries, but then beyond it as well. Even despite all of the impacts of that pandemic, it's been incredibly impressive to see that resilience and that engagement and commitment, and frankly, social commitment a lot of the time from the creative industries. And as I say, I really do think that there is a bright future for the creative industries. It's something that I'm very, very proud about. And, as Shadow Chancellor, certainly it's something that I've continually tried to promote, because I don't think that we make anything like as much as we should do as a country of the strength of our creative industries, and particularly their potential for growth into the future.
Thank you. Okay, so I should actually let the audience know, I can't remember if I said this at the beginning, but we're going to be finishing at 2:45. So we've got 10 minutes now for audience questions. I'm going to start with one that was sent in advance from Dr. Tamsin Dent, who's at King's College, who has actually worked with us in the Culture, Media and Communication department in the past. And she asks, so we've been using the terminology creative industries, and she asks whether this is the relevant concept or terminology, and whether we should be thinking of moving towards a more ecological concept of the creative economy.
I think that's a really interesting question. And actually, we do see how across so many different parts of, not just the economy, but obviously society more generally, in which it's embedded, that we're much more used, I suppose, to seeing cultural aspects of that, or that kind of creativity being more a part of our experience. You look at the growth. This is probably a very, very explicit way of looking at it, but just the growth of public art, for example, that we've seen over recent years, I think is really, really interesting. I was brought up in Aberdeenshire, and the whole of the city centre looks so different because of the public art that's been commissioned on large buildings. And that's just taken place over a few years. And we've seen that taking place in many, many different parts of the country. As I say, that's one just very explicit element. We can take it from there right down to the aspects of design that we see all around us, where the link between creativity in terms of, I suppose, a more artistic endeavour compared to engineering, and the creativity in that area, is very, very strong, and it always has been, of course, in the history of design. But I think becoming more and more so now, as many products become more sophisticated and digitized. So I think there is that, I suppose, penetration across so much of our life now from creatives more generally. But I think it's important that we don't kind of look at this just as a question of what can be monetized. It is about much more than that. This is about society's experience of creativity and the creative arts more generally as well, and that link, as I said before, to well-being and to what makes different communities and different societies also.
Thank you. Okay, from Heidi Ashton, who's a researcher in cultural and creative work at the Centre for Culture and Media Policy Studies at University of Warwick, says the introduction of the EBAC and the exclusion of the arts from state education will increase inequality and decrease diversity in the sector. Are there any plans to challenge this or foreground arts in education below the level of HE?
Yeah, I mean,
so school age education.
Absolutely, and we are concerned about this, certainly from my party's perspective. Kate Green, who's our Shadow Secretary of State for Education, has been very concerned about narrowing of the curriculum in a way that some might present it as somehow leading to more of a focus on particular subjects, literacy and numeracy. But actually we find that if you don't have that more rounded education, particularly at young age, that it can, that can have a knock-on impact, right across the panoply of subjects, very, very obviously. I mean, I'm sure people on this call would take that for granted, but it seems like so often it's missed out of government thinking. And it then does lead to, pretty much a kind of privatization of those cultural opportunities. If you only have a handful of kids in a class who are going to be able to experience, for example, a music education to any great degree, then it will be those, yes, there will be some who might be supported, small number, but others, they would need to be in a position where their parents could pay for it, and very often they won't be in that position, or indeed where it be able for them to and possible for them to access it just logistically. So I think it's very socially inequitous, as well as obviously having that impact just in general on the experience that children will have through school, their enjoyment of school, and ultimately their academic achievement as well.
Thank you. So I've got a question from Professor Anita Baresi. Going back to Gavin Williamsons' cuts agenda for arts subjects in higher education, she asks what opportunities are coming up in the immediate term, in the next few weeks, for you and Labour to challenge these, and what will you do?
Yeah, so we have been already, and we will keep that pressure on, as I said, particularly in relation to Williamson's plans. I would say about the other issues that we've been talking about, we have the so-called Queen's Speech next week, which is when the government sets out its legislative agenda. So, the kind of different measures it's going to want to put in place over the Parliament to come. And certainly there, we will really want to ensure that there is that strong support for our creative industries into the future, which has simply not been there during this pandemic to the extent that it should have been. And as you'd anticipate, I have been working already closely with Jo Stevens, who's our Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. Will continue to be doing that through the period of the Queen's Speech, because I really am concerned, as we talked about before, about the fact that that this area was growing and growing faster than many other parts of the UK economy before the pandemic. That's not then been reflected in how it's been supported. And government needs to be having a much more expansive view, I would say, of the role of creative industries for our economy, as well as for well-being in the future.
So I have a question. So there's a few related questions. I'm going to take Meg Franson's one, but just worth saying that a number of people have asked related questions to this. And she says, what can we do to improve paid work opportunities in the creative industries if we aren't in a position to offer them? So we've talked a lot about the extremely difficult conditions, the difficult work conditions, the difficult employment practices, the poor pay conditions. But what can those organisations do if they are just simply not in a financial position to offer more?
Yeah, and I think that is a very big challenge. It's one that we find in the charity sector as well, where there's a lot of the same dynamics. Obviously, organisations that are really heavily cash strapped, where it's very, very difficult ultimately to get the work done that needs to be done a lot of the time in those circumstances. So I do recognise that. I mean, I would say that I think particularly as we come out of the pandemic, we need to recognise that there must be change, I would say, in the labour market in this sector. I think it's been too precarious. That's led to many problems around support. I mean, I do think, as I said before, that government could and should have amended its support schemes to, really fill in some of those gaps. But, there were gaps there because of a lot of the time that very precarious employment model. So I think there will need to be change in the labour market. Now, that's got to be driven by government. That's not something that individual organisations themselves can deal with. But, a lot of the time there is competition between organisations, and it can't be based on, getting kind of costs lowered in terms of the workforce. That cannot be the model that's adopted here. I think also when it comes to certainly government responsibility, we see far too much really short-term funding that's available, rather than having a longer term basis, particularly from public funding, that can then enable workforce planning, really. And certainly, my commitment as Shadow Chancellor is to say, look, we shouldn't be having these kind of 2 to 3 year funding horizons, where sometimes, in the arts we see, other areas, they might have a funding stream which is announced, you've got 3 months to bid for it, then it'll apply for 6 months, and then it's switched off again. That is a disaster when it comes to ensuring that people have that proper employment relationship into the future, and that you build up that capacity and skills. So I've said that we need to have, a 10-year funding horizon, or 20 or 30 years, so that you can actually enable organisations to plan much better. That can then help around the workforce side. But I appreciate it is very difficult, and organisations often feel that they're kind of put in a position where they've got to make some quite invidious choices here that in an ideal world they really wouldn't want to be making.
Okay, I've got one last question that we'll squeeze in very quickly. It's combining two questions that are similar that have come in. So this is from Paolo Russo and Barbara Eichner, both academics here and members, or Paolo is one of the network leads of the Creative Industries Networks, and both based at Brookes. So Paolo says government support is in fact peanuts, basically 0.1% investment to worth ratio, unlike any other key sector of the economy. And the creative industries have pretty much supported themselves, which has worked well for a decade, but in light of Brexit and the pandemic, the landscape has changed dramatically. So does Labour have a clear plan looking ahead with figures to support it? And that will be our last question of the day.
Yeah, so we will be setting out our precise plans before the next general election, and obviously that's potentially some time away, 2 or 3 years away. But in the interim, what we've been doing is working with many different organisations in the cultural industries and creative industries to understand what they need for the future. I've said, first of all, there needs to be a much longer term focus. We cannot continue with these 2 to 3 year funding horizons. We've seen in the pandemic very short term funding when it's been available to organisations, and so much it's been a pot of money that can then be bid into, which isn't necessarily very helpful if you're talking about the ecosystem of creative organisations and individuals in a particular city or town, for example, where having a longer term horizon really would make sense, and pooled funding that can then be worked on together. So I can be very clear that we would have that much more integrated approach around the precise elements of funding. For example, we will be developing those plans, as I said, up to the general election. So really we'd want to work with all of you on them, and particularly about how we can really back those creative industries into the recovery as well. What we can do so that we're making sure that people are enjoying those creative industries again, building employment in them, and really guaranteeing that bright future as well.
Anneliese, thank you so much for your time today. And just wishing you lots of luck for the. Am I allowed to say that as chair? Probably my position is clear. Yeah, wishing you lots of luck for the results coming in over the rest of the day. And I want to thank our audience who have been so lively in the chat. There's been just a huge kind of conversations and debates going on. And thank you so many of you for coming. And it's really is just the best end to the first week of our festival. Anneliese mentioned the fantastic Cowley Road Carnival. We have an event on Caribbean Legacies in Oxford on the 25th of May. Please, everybody come to that as well. And please, everybody book for the rest of the festival. Anneliese, thank you so much for your time. It really has been fantastic.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed, everyone. And all the best for the rest of the festival. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.